It's Valentine's Day, and it's time to talk about love.
Oh, that was 24 years ago.
24 years ago.
And it was on Easter Sunday.
In this episode, we're focusing on interracial and intercultural couples in the U.S.
Just little things like
oh, don't rub my hair backwards.
hair.
Can't do that.
Like, I didn't know.
Yeah, you can't do that.
We went out to a restaurant and we ordered deviled eggs, and I don't think I'd ever eaten deviled eggs before visiting your family. Your mom makes great deviled eggs. They're really good.
And we'll ask why it took until 1967 to legalize interracial marriage.
They made that work 50 years ago. I'd like to think I would do the same.
But how common is interracial marriage, and has technology changed how we choose partners?
I don't date black guys. I don't date Asian guys, right? This is something that people will say. People have implicit biases about members of different groups.
Do you remember your first impressions of each other?
Wow,
Oh gosh.
very much.
Tricky. Okay, what do you say?
No, wow, it was wow.
Okay, wow. Okay. Well, yeah, I thought he was cute. That's no.
Even before we started dating, I think I was probably attracted to you before you were attracted to me.
Yeah, probably.
We have different countries we grew up in. We have different religious backgrounds.
He's little, I'm large.
You were nervous. You were really nervous. I thought something was wrong.
I was, yeah. I mean,
So tell me about some of the challenges that y'all face being an interracial, intercultural couple.
The first time I took you to meet my mother, I went in to see her in a little apartment, and she and her sister were sitting there, and Carl, I said, wait outside till I tell them about this. And my sister suddenly yelled, there's a black man outside, what are we going to do? I said, well, we should bring him in, because he's with me.
The challenges that we face coming from different backgrounds are not necessarily intrinsically tied to race, but rather from being more of like an intercultural relationship.
the funny
We
one
get
that we had
quips.
is that we were on the subway once, on our way up to Harlem, and we were sat opposite this chap, black guy, so it's obviously Kylie and myself, and he turns around to me and he goes, hey man, you seen Get Out?
So how long has this been going on, this thing?
And I just thought, yeah, your point?
When you guys walk down the street, do people assume you're a couple?
No. I would say no. We're quite different.
People don't assume we're together. So there's always sort of that look of surprise when you're talking about your husband and then all of a sudden he comes up next to you and people don't assume that that's your husband.
And then there's this moment of, oh, okay.
How nice.
If you two had met and started dating in the 40s or 50s, how do you think things would have been different?
Very. At that time, black people were looked upon in Britain as inferior.
I have this kind of nostalgia of I think diners are really cool, and kind of the 50s are like the heyday of like diner culture.
But then you think about sort of the darker side of that
Right.
and what that covered up. I mean, it's kind of sad to think about all these things that we like about that era,
Right.
but then how in many ways we would have been prevented from being together.
Right.
So we're getting married in November, and the fact we couldn't get married blows my mind, just because of what we look like.
Yeah.
It was only 52 years ago that interracial marriage was legalized in the U.S., but the complex history of sexual relations between people of different races extends back centuries.
So there were these formal laws that kept purposefully blacks and whites separate. We've always had anti-miscegenation laws. Sometimes they were between whites and Native Americans. Sometimes they involved Asian people, Pacific Islanders. But no matter where you were, no matter what anti-miscegenation law that was passed occurred, African Americans were always included in who whites were not supposed to marry.
So in the 20s, many states passed laws that forbid marriage between a white person and any other person. And that lasted until the Loving case got to the U.S. Supreme Court.
These statutes are slavery statutes. They're meant to keep the Negro people in the badges and bonds.
And so with the Loving v. Virginia case, we see the couple, Richard and Mildred Loving, who ended up suing the state of Virginia to have their marriage counted as valid.
I woke up and it was the policeman standing beside the bed. and he told us to get up, that we was under arrest.
The Lovings had been arrested in the late 1950s for breaking the state's anti-miscegenation statute that forbid whites to marry people of color. In the late 1960s, Phil and a team of lawyers represented the Loving case before the U.S. Supreme Court.
I still don't believe it, but, I feel free now.
She came across as someone who you just wanted to take her hand and say, yeah, I'll help you. She was just a delightful, warm person. He was very cold. He just wanted no part of this. He wanted to be with his family. He wanted nothing to do with lawyers, I'll tell you that.
What happened after that?
Well, I left.
And took your wife with you?
That's right.
When the case got to the Supreme Court, 17 states still outlawed interracial marriage. But the federal court's decision legalized intermarriage across the nation after the Supreme Court decides that it is legal now for whites to marry people of color. Did everyone start marrying each other?
Yes. Didn't you know? No, of course not. No.
But attitudes were changing.
John, Wade, Joanna Prentice I'll be.
That same year, Hollywood released Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and made history.
Mrs. Drayton, I'm medically qualified, so I hope you wouldn't think it presumptuous if I say you ought to sit down before you fall down, I mean.
He thinks you're gonna faint because he's a Negro.
But despite Hollywood's efforts, some interracial couples continue to face discrimination, even in 2019.
I was at an event and Barb and my son were in a room and they could overhear some of the cleaning personnel saying, I would never let my child marry a black person.
Ron grew up in the Bronx. Barb grew up in Minnesota.
There weren't too many people of color in my neighborhood or in my community. So it wasn't literally until I went to college in Duluth where I had interactions with people of color.
So people tend to marry people who they come into contact with. Residential segregation is at the very crux of understanding race in the United States.
I never dated anybody of color prior to Ron.
And so what was your family's reaction through all this?
My mom was concerned the assumptions were real for her. And it wasn't until she got to know Ron that she became to love him.
And I got to know her.
And
I started loving her.
One of the things that I found was that couples involving black husbands and white wives were more likely to experience white family rejection than couples involving white men with black women.
I didn't do any work to win her mother over. I think eventually her family and others just could see our love and be supportive of it and move on. I was also a little outspoken and stubborn.
And today it's great. They have always come out to visit us. Once or twice a year. My mom always comes out during the holidays.
I know a lot of people paved the way. We're still working, and we're hoping that others don't have to work nearly as hard as we did.
Technology presents a unique opportunity to meet people of different backgrounds.
We met on a dating app.
We connected on, is it embarrassing to say?
No, it's fine.
OkCupid.
So has technology brought us closer together or farther apart?
I don't think it's done either. One can make the argument that because we live in a residentially segregated society, so now we have access to people who don't live in our neighborhoods, who don't even live in our cities or states. But on the other hand, we see that people still enact these ethno-racial preferences when determining who is a person that they would want to date.
Although technology has broadened our horizons, it's also allowed us to choose our perfect match, which sometimes means specifying race.
Today in 2019, one of the most tolerated forms of practicing racial discrimination is actually in dating and marriage. So people talk a lot about preferences. I don't date black guys. I don't date Asian guys, right? This is something that people will say. People have implicit biases about members of different groups.
Data shows that white people are less likely to marry outside their race. And do we see a common pairing?
With people who are Latinx, what we see happening is that both men and women tend to intermarry equally. But when we look at Asians, for example, we see that Asian women are more likely to intermarry than Asian men are. And the same is true for African Americans. We see that black men are twice as likely to intermarry as black women are.
Chinyere said that this has a lot to do with gendered and racialized stereotypes that are rooted in white supremacy. But research also shows that the likelihood of intermarriage increases with formal education.
Most people marry people who they go to school with every day, and we know that the United States is not only a segregated society, that we are hyper-segregated. And so what happens is that most people who end up interracially marrying today, they tend to be college students. Because college provides an opportunity for people all of a sudden to interact with people of a different ethnic or racial group.
I feel I should be ordering up a drink.
Despite the challenges these couples face, interracial marriage has continued to double each decade since the Loving case. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cut Through the Noise. Like us on Facebook and join the conversation. We'll be back next Thursday. What's the weirdest thing about your husband?
The weirdest thing about him?
He will set an alarm to brush his teeth.
I find it weird that you know the words to all of the songs and all of the things, that you can know who everybody was, remember the name of this one and that one. It's weird to me, but it's not weird.
It's not weird.